The cabin door slammed shut behind her, and Lila Mercer knew she'd been sold again. At 19, bruised and broken, she'd learned that men who paid for women never wanted companions. They wanted servants, or worse. The silent farmer who'd bought her passage hadn't spoken a single word during the 2-day wagon ride. Now he stood between her and the only exit, his massive frame blocking the fading sunlight. One bed, one man, one terrifying night ahead. But what happened next would shatter everything she thought she knew about survival, trust, and the possibility of home. If you want to see how Lila's story unfolds, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon wheels had fallen silent an hour ago. Lila Mercer sat rigid on the splintered bench, her carpetbag clutched against her chest like a shield that might actually protect her from what was coming. The driver, a tobacco-stained man named Wendell, who'd barely looked at her since they'd left the way station, had deposited her at the end of a rutted dirt path and pointed toward a thin column of smoke rising above the cottonwood trees. Boon farms that way. Half-mile, maybe less. He'd spat into the dust. He paid your passage, so you best not keep him waiting. Then he'd snapped the reins and left her there, alone with her fear and the growing dark. Now, standing at the edge of a clearing with the last rays of September sunlight bleeding through the Montana sky, Lila studied the farm that would be her prison. The cabin was rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney leaning slightly to the east. There was a barn that had seen better years, a chicken coop, and a garden plot gone mostly to seed. Everything spoke of a man living alone, barely holding on. The door opened. He stepped out onto the porch, and Lila's breath caught. Silas Boon was not what she'd expected. She'd braced herself for old and cruel, or young and mean. Instead, he stood somewhere in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that covered half his face. His clothes were clean but worn, homespun shirt, suspenders, work pants that had been mended more than once. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his eyes, even from this distance, were the color of winter slate. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he descended the steps and crossed the yard with a stride that ate up the ground between them. Lila forced herself not to step back. She'd learned that showing fear only made things worse. "You're the girl from the arrangement," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like creek stones grinding together. "Yes, sir." Her own voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Lila Mercer." He nodded once. "Silas Boon." He reached for her bag. She flinched before she could stop herself. His hand froze in midair. Something flickered across his face, not anger, but something else she couldn't name. Slowly, carefully, he withdrew his hand and gestured toward the cabin instead. "You'll want to get inside. Temperature drops fast once the sun's down." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her to follow. Lila grabbed her bag and hurried after him, her worn boots crunching on the dry earth. The porch steps creaked under her weight. He held the door open without looking at her, and she slipped past him into the dim interior. The cabin was a single room, maybe 20 feet by 15. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with a small fire. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a washstand, shelves lined with tin plates and cups, a cast-iron stove, and against the far wall, one bed. Lila's stomach turned to ice. She heard the door close behind her, heard his footsteps on the plank floor. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her bag until her knuckles went white. "You can put your things there." He pointed to a wooden peg on the wall. "Supper's ready. You should eat." She turned to face him, searching his expression for the cruelty she knew had to be hiding there. Men didn't pay a woman's passage 300 miles just to feed her supper, but his face revealed nothing. He simply moved to the stove and began ladling something from a pot into 2 tin bowls. The smell hit her then, venison stew, rich and savory. Her stomach twisted with hunger she'd been trying to ignore for 2 days. He set both bowls on the table, then pulled out one of the chairs and looked at her expectantly. Lila lowered her bag to the floor and approached the table like she was approaching a trap. She sat down slowly, perched on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt. Silas settled into the opposite chair with the ease of a man who'd sat in it 1,000 times. He picked up his spoon and began to eat, his eyes on his bowl. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lila lifted her own spoon with trembling fingers. The stew was hot and well-seasoned, better than anything she'd tasted in months. She ate 3 careful bites, then 4, waiting for him to speak, to tell her what he expected, to explain the terms of her bondage. He said nothing. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, a coyote called in the distance. Silas finished his stew, set down his spoon, and rose to pour water from a pitcher into 2 cups. He set one in front of her and returned to his seat. "You've come a long way," he said finally. "The arrangement company said you'd worked in a boarding house in St. Louis." "Yes, sir." "You know how to cook? Clean?" "Yes, sir." He nodded. "I work the land from sunup to sundown most days. I need someone to keep the house, tend the chickens, manage the garden. There's washing, mending, canning when the season comes. It's hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Lila said, though her voice wavered. "Good." He drained his cup and stood. "You look tired. You should sleep." He crossed to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. Then he grabbed a pillow from the bed, the only pillow, and dropped both on the floor near the fireplace. Lila stared at him, confusion cutting through her fear. "I don't understand." He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something almost like discomfort cross his features. "The bed's yours," he said. "I'll sleep here. But I don't expect anything from you except the work we agreed on." His tone was firm, final. "The bed's yours. That's the end of it." He knelt and began arranging the blanket on the floor, his movements efficient and practiced, like he'd done this before. Lila sat frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Men didn't give up their beds. Men didn't keep their distance. Men didn't— "You should get some rest," Silas said without looking at her. "Morning comes early on a farm." She rose on unsteady legs and moved toward the bed. It was a simple frame with a corn husk mattress and a quilt that had been patched many times. She sat down on the edge, still wearing her travel-stained dress, still unable to believe this was real. Silas banked the fire and settled onto his makeshift pallet, his back to her. "Blow out the lamp when you're ready," he said. Lila reached for the oil lamp on the small table beside the bed. Her hand shook as she turned down the wick, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by the dim glow of the dying fire. She lay down fully clothed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling beams she could barely see. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every muscle in her body remained tense, waiting for the sound of him rising, crossing the floor, reaching for her in the dark. But the only sounds were the crackling fire and his steady breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, the terror that had lived in her chest for so long began to loosen its grip. Not gone. It would never be truly gone, but quiet enough that she could draw a full breath. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Lila Mercer closed her eyes and slept without fear. Dawn came cold and gray. Lila woke to the sound of the door closing and sat up in a panic, disoriented by the unfamiliar room. Then memory flooded back. The farm, the silent man, the bed he'd given her. She was alone in the cabin. She threw off the quilt and hurried to the window, pressing her face against the rippled glass. Silas was crossing the yard toward the barn, an axe over his shoulder, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had 100 tasks waiting and daylight to burn. Lila turned and took in the cabin by morning light. The fire had burned down to embers. The floor where Silas had slept was empty, the blanket already folded and returned to the trunk. The breakfast dishes from yesterday were washed and stacked on the shelf. She felt a strange twist of something in her chest. Guilt, maybe. Or shame. He'd worked yesterday, slept on the floor, and still risen early while she'd slept in his bed. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Moving quickly, she rebuilt the fire and set water to boil. She found cornmeal in a tin and bacon wrapped in cheesecloth. She'd cooked for 20 boarders at a time back in St. Louis. Surely she could manage breakfast for 2. But the cornmeal was coarser than what she was used to, and the bacon spit and popped in the skillet like it was angry at her. When Silas returned an hour later, the cabin was full of smoke and the Johnny cakes were black on one side and raw on the other. He stopped in the doorway, surveying the disaster. "I'm sorry," Lila blurted, twisting her apron in her hands. I The stove, it's hotter than what I'm used to, and the cornmeal. It's fine, he said. It's not fine, it's ruined. It's fine, he repeated, crossing to the table. He sat down and began scraping the burned parts off a Johnny cake with his knife. I've eaten worse. Lila stood paralyzed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the criticism, the punishment, the reminder that she was useless. Silas ate 3 of the half-burned cakes without complaint, washing them down with the coffee she'd made too strong. When he finished, he stood and carried his plate to the wash basin. You'll figure it out, he said. Takes time to learn a new stove. Then he put his hat on and walked back outside. Lila stared after him, completely bewildered. Took him. The days began to take on a rhythm. Silas rose before dawn and worked the land, mending fences, chopping wood, tending to the small herd of cattle he kept in the far pasture. Lila tackled the endless domestic work, hauling water from the well, scrubbing floors, feeding chickens that seemed to hold personal grudges against her. She burned more meals, shrunk one of his shirts in the wash, and somehow managed to let half the eggs get crushed in the basket. Each failure felt like proof of what she'd always suspected. She wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, didn't deserve the small mercy she'd been shown. But Silas never said a word. He ate the burned stew. He wore the shrunken shirt. He found the broken eggs and simply cleaned them up, then showed her, without speaking, how to layer straw in the basket to keep them safe. His silence had terrified her at first. Now it was becoming something different, a steady presence, a refusal to criticize what didn't need criticizing. They rarely spoke. Silas seemed to have no use for idle conversation, and Lila had spent too many years learning that speaking up only brought trouble. But sometimes, in the evening after supper, he would make simple observations. Snow's coming early this year, can smell it. Cattle are putting on good weight. Creek's running low, we'll need to haul extra water. They weren't conversations exactly, more like reports from a distant land. But Lila found herself listening for them, these small glimpses into how his mind worked. 3 weeks after her arrival, everything changed. She was making supper, beans and cornbread, the 2 things she'd finally learned not to ruin, when the skillet handle shifted. She grabbed for it without thinking, her bare hand closing around cast iron that had been sitting over the fire for an hour. The pain was instant and blinding. She gasped and jerked back, cradling her hand against her chest. The skillet clattered to the floor, sending beans scattering across the boards. "Damn it," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "Damn it! Damn it!" The door banged open. Silas filled the doorway, his face sharp with alarm. His eyes swept the room, searching for danger, then landed on her. "What happened?" "Nothing, I'm fine, He crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her wrist, turning her hand palm up. The burn was already blistering, an angry red stripe across her palm. His jaw tightened. "Stay here," he commanded, then turned and strode outside. Lila stood trembling, still cradling her hand, wondering what she'd done wrong. If he was angry, if this would be the moment his patience finally ran out. He returned less than a minute later carrying a pail of cold water from the well. He set it on the table and guided her hand into it with a gentleness that stole her breath. "Keep it there," he said. "Cold water first. Then we'll wrap it." Lila bit her lip against the pain, watching him move around the cabin with sudden purpose. He righted the skillet, swept up the spilled beans, and pulled a small tin from one of the high shelves. When he returned to her side, he had clean cloth torn into strips and a jar of something that smelled like herbs and lard. "Let me see." She lifted her hand from the water. He dried it carefully with a cloth, then applied the salve with fingers that were surprisingly gentle for their size. The relief was immediate. He wrapped her palm with the strips of cloth, tying them securely but not too tight. "That should help," he said. "Keep it clean and dry. Change the bandage tomorrow." "Thank you," Lila whispered. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. Concern, actual, genuine concern. "You need to be more careful," he said, but there was no anger in it, just a rough kind of worry. "I know, I'm sorry. I ruined supper. I don't give a damn about supper." The words came out harder than she'd expected. "I care that you're hurt." Lila stared at him, completely unable to respond. Silas cleared his throat and stepped back like he'd surprised himself. I'll finish cleaning up. You should sit down. He turned away and busied himself with salvaging what was left of the meal, leaving Lila to sink into a chair with her bandaged hand and a feeling she couldn't name spreading through her chest. He cared that she was hurt, not about the wasted food, not about the inconvenience, about her. It's all. That night, after they'd eaten a quiet supper of bread and the beans he'd managed to save, Silas banked the fire and prepared his usual place on the floor. But as Lila rose to go to the bed, she saw him hesitate. "Your hand," he said. Does it hurt much?" "It's better," she said. "The salve helped." He nodded, looking like he wanted to say something else but didn't know how. Lila climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up, watching him settle onto his blanket. The firelight played across his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the shadow of his beard, the way his shoulders curved slightly forward like he was protecting something precious. "Mr. Boon," she said into the darkness. "Silas," he corrected quietly. "Just Silas." "Silas," she repeated, testing the name. Why did you send for me? Through the arrangement company?" The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "This farm," he said finally, "it's too much for one person. I tried for 3 years to keep it going alone. Nearly broke myself doing it." He paused. "And a house needs someone in it. Otherwise it's just a building. But you could have hired help, a farmhand. You didn't need to." "To what? Bring a woman here?" He shifted and she heard the blanket rustle. "Maybe I did. Maybe I was tired of talking to cattle and chickens. Maybe I wanted—" He trailed off. "What?" Lila pressed, surprised by her own boldness. "Someone to build something with," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "Not just work beside. Build with." The words settled over her like the quilt, heavy and warm. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "I don't know if I know how." "Neither do I," Silas said. "But I figure we can learn." Lila lay in the darkness, her bandaged hand resting on her stomach, and felt something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the first fragile possibility of it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whispering through the gaps in the walls. Winter was coming to Montana, and with it, 100 new challenges. But for the first time since the wagon had dropped her at the end of that dirt road, Lila thought she might actually survive them. Not just survive, maybe even belong. The following days brought an unexpected thaw, not in the weather, but between them. Silas began leaving small kindnesses in his wake. A split log placed perfectly for her to reach. Fresh water hauled to the house before she woke. The heavy cast iron moved to the back of the stove where she couldn't burn herself again. He never mentioned these things, never drew attention to them. But Lila noticed. She tried to return the gestures in kind. She mended his shirts more carefully, reinforcing the seams she knew took the most strain. She learned to make coffee the way he liked it, strong enough to strip paint, as he'd once muttered with something that might have been approval. She even figured out how to make biscuits that didn't double as weapons. They still barely spoke. But the silence between them was changing, becoming something almost comfortable. Then came the day she saw the bruise. Lila had been reaching for a high shelf when her sleeve slid up, exposing the inside of her left wrist. The mark was old, faded to a sickly yellow-green, but the shape was unmistakable. 4 fingers and a thumb, wrapped tight. She yanked her sleeve down instantly, but not fast enough. When she turned, Silas was standing in the doorway with an armload of firewood. He'd gone absolutely still, his eyes fixed on her wrist. "Who did that to you?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Lila's throat closed. "It's nothing. It's old." "Who?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." He set the wood down carefully, like he was afraid of what his hands might do if he didn't control them. "Did someone hurt you? Before you came here?" Lila wrapped her arms around herself, the familiar shame rising like bile. "I don't want to talk about it." She saw the war happening behind his eyes, the need to know fighting against the respect for her boundaries. Finally, with visible effort, he stepped back. "All right," he said. "But Lila?" She looked at him, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "Nobody's going to hurt you here," he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. "Not while I'm breathing. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak. Silas held her gaze a moment longer, then bent to stack the firewood by the hearth. But Lila saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. He was angry, not at her, but for her, at whoever had left that mark. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel something she'd almost forgotten existed. Protected. What? After that day, something shifted in how Silas moved through the world around her. He wasn't hovering, he was too respectful for that, but he'd positioned himself as a barrier between her and anything that might bring harm. When they went to town for supplies 2 weeks later, he stayed close. When the general store clerk made a comment about new arrangements with a knowing smirk, Silas's hand found the small of Lila's back, a brief, steadying pressure, and his response was ice. "The lady's name is Miss Mercer. You'll use it." The clerk's smirk died. On the ride home, Lila found her voice. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Silas said, "I did." She studied his profile as he drove the wagon, the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with absolute confidence. He wasn't a man who wasted words or made empty gestures. Everything he did meant something. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The wagon wheels creaked. The horses plodded steadily through the afternoon. "My father," he said finally, "he had a temper. Got worse when he drank, which was often. My mother, she wore long sleeves even in summer." He paused. "I was 12 when I got big enough to step between them, 15 when he finally left. I swore then I'd never be that kind of man." Lila's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just know that's why." He glanced at her. "A man's supposed to protect what's his, not damage it." "I'm not yours," Lila said softly, but without edge. "No," Silas agreed. "You're your own, but you're under my roof, which makes you my responsibility, and I take my responsibilities seriously." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but Lila's mind was racing. Every interaction, every small kindness, every careful boundary, it was all starting to make sense. Silas Boon wasn't just keeping his distance out of disinterest. He was keeping it out of respect, out of a bone-deep determination never to be the kind of man who took what wasn't freely given. The question forming in her mind, slowly and surely, was this: what would happen if she chose to give it? October bled into November, and with it came the first real cold. Frost painted the windows each morning. The chickens huddled in their coop. Silas spent long days reinforcing the barn and stacking firewood high enough to last through winter. Lila threw herself into preparing the house. She made curtains from spare fabric Silas had bought in town, thick enough to keep out drafts. She organized the root cellar, counting potatoes and turnips and jars of preserves. She even scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, driven by a need to prove her worth she couldn't quite explain. But her real project was the garden. The summer plot had gone to seed before she arrived, but there was still time to plant for an early spring harvest. Lila studied the patch of earth behind the cabin, imagining it full of green shoots and vegetables. It would be her contribution, proof she could build something, not just maintain it. She started working the soil on a crisp afternoon when Silas was out checking fence lines. The ground was harder than she'd expected, full of rocks and stubborn roots. But she attacked it with determination, using a spade she'd found in the barn. An hour passed. Then 2. Her back ached. Her hands blistered. The sun climbed higher, surprisingly fierce for November, and sweat soaked through her dress. But she kept going. She would make this garden work. She would show Silas she could do more than burn breakfast and break eggs. She would prove. The world tilted. Lila dropped the spade and staggered, her vision swimming with black spots. The sky wheeled overhead. She tried to take a step toward the house, and her legs folded beneath her. The last thing she remembered was the hard-packed earth rushing up to meet her face. She woke to cool darkness and the sound of water being wrung from cloth. "Easy," a voice said. Silas's voice, rough with something that might have been fear. Don't try to sit up yet. Lila blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was in the bed. His bed. Hers now, but she didn't remember getting there. A damp cloth rested on her forehead. Another was being pressed to her wrists. What happened? Her voice came out as a croak. You collapsed in the garden. I found you when I came back. His face swam into view above her, tight with worry. You've got heat exhaustion, maybe sun poisoning. Why the hell were you out there so long without water, without a hat? I was planting You were killing yourself. The words came out sharp, but his hands remained gentle as he pressed the cool cloth to her throat. The garden can wait. You can't. I wanted to help, Lila whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. I wanted to prove what? Silas demanded. That you can work yourself into an early grave. That's not help, Lila. That's... He stopped, visibly reining himself in. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. You don't have to prove anything. Not to me. But she did. She always had to prove she deserved the space she took up, the food she ate, the kindness she was shown. Didn't she? Silas seemed to read the doubt on her face. He sat back with a heavy sigh, dragging a hand through his hair. Listen to me, he said. I don't know what happened to you before you came here. I don't know who made you think you had to earn every scrap of basic human decency, but that's not how it works under this roof. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. You belong here because you're here. That's it. That's the only reason you need. The tears spilled over then, hot and shameful. Lila turned her face away, but Silas caught her chin gently, turning her back. Don't hide from me, he said softly. Not here. Something broke open in her chest. All the fear, all the shame, all the carefully constructed walls. They cracked and crumbled. And Silas Boon, this quiet, careful man who'd given her nothing but patience and respect, sat beside her and let her cry without trying to fix it or shut it down. When the tears finally stopped, he brought her water and made her drink. Then he sat in the chair beside the bed and stayed there, keeping watch, until she fell into an exhausted sleep. She woke once in the night and saw him still there, his head tilted back against the chair, his breathing deep and even. He'd covered himself with his blanket but hadn't moved to the floor. He was standing guard. Against what, Lila wasn't sure. Fever, maybe, or nightmares, or just the general cruelty of a world that had taught her to expect the worst. She closed her eyes and let the steady rhythm of his breathing pull her back under. When morning came, she was stronger. And so was the fragile thing growing between them, roots pushing deep into soil, preparing for whatever storms lay ahead. Lila spent the next 2 days confined to the bed under Silas's watchful eye, and she hated every minute of it. Not because of the rest itself. Her body desperately needed it. But because watching him do everything made her feel useless in a way that scraped against old wounds. He cooked, cleaned, hauled water, fed the chickens, and still managed to get his own work done, all while checking on her every few hours like she might vanish if he looked away too long. You don't have to do this, she told him on the second afternoon when he brought her soup he'd somehow managed not to burn. I can get up. I feel better. You look like a strong wind could knock you over, Silas said, setting the bowl on the small table beside the bed. Another day won't kill you. It might kill me from boredom. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You could read. There's books on the shelf. Lila glanced at the small collection of worn volumes stacked near the window. I didn't know you were a reading man. My mother taught me before she died. Said a man who couldn't read was at the mercy of those who could. He paused. I'm not much for fancy stories, but I like knowing how things work. Got a book on animal husbandry, one on crop rotation, another on weather patterns. Sounds thrilling, Lila said, but there was no bite in it. There's one about plants, Silas offered. Garden plants, medicinal herbs. Might help with that project you're so determined to kill yourself over. This time Lila did smile, just a little. I wasn't trying to kill myself. Could have fooled me. He turned to leave, then stopped. Eat the soup, all of it. I'll check. He would too. Lila had learned that Silas Boon didn't make idle threats or empty promises. If he said he'd do something, it got done. She ate the soup, which was surprisingly good, thick with vegetables and bits of salt pork, and then reached for the book on plants. It was old and well-worn, the pages soft from handling. Someone had made notes in the margins, a feminine hand that must have been his mother's. Lila traced the faded ink with her finger, imagining a woman who'd once stood in this cabin, teaching her son to read, not knowing he'd grow into the kind of man who'd offer that same gentleness to a stranger. By the third day, Lila couldn't stand another minute of confinement. When Silas left to work on the barn roof, she threw off the quilt and stood on shaky legs. The dizziness had passed. Her strength was returning. She was done being helpless. She made it to the wash basin before he caught her. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice came from the doorway, sharp with alarm. Lila straightened, gripping the edge of the basin for support. "I'm washing my face. Is that allowed, or do I need permission for that too?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Silas's expression shuddered, and she immediately regretted it. "I didn't mean—" "You want to get up? Fine," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "But you take it slow. You push too hard and end up flat on your back again. Don't expect sympathy." He walked out, the door closing a little harder than necessary behind him. Lila sank onto the edge of the bed, guilt churning in her stomach. He'd done nothing but take care of her, and she'd snapped at him like a cornered animal. But that's what she was, wasn't it? An animal that had been kicked so many times it bit at kindness because it didn't know what else to do. She needed to apologize. She needed to explain that his protectiveness, however well-intentioned, made her feel trapped in ways he couldn't understand. But the words tangled in her throat, heavy and useless. Instead, she forced herself to stand and began the work of proving she was ready. She tidied the cabin, moving slowly but steadily. She fed the chickens, careful not to overexert herself. She even started a pot of stew, determined to make something edible without assistance. When Silas came in for supper, his eyes swept the cabin, taking in the swept floor, the tidy shelves, the pot, bubbling on the stove. His jaw was still tight, but some of the hardness had left his face. "Smells good," he said quietly. "It's just stew." "Still smells good." They ate in their familiar silence, but this time it felt strained, like a rope pulled too taut. Lila couldn't stand it. "I'm sorry," she blurted, "for what I said earlier. You didn't deserve that." Silas set down his spoon and looked at her. "You were frustrated. I understand. That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed, "but I understand it anyway." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I know I can be overbearing. My mother used to say I treated every problem like a fence that needed mending. Just hammer at it until it's fixed. But people aren't fences." "No," Lila said softly. "They're not. So if I push too hard, I'm sorry too." The apology, simple and genuine, eased something in her chest. She nodded, and the tension between them loosened like a knot coming undone. They finished their meal in a more comfortable quiet, and when Silas prepared his bedroll that night, Lila didn't argue, but she noticed he placed it a little closer to the bed than usual, close enough that if she needed him in the night, he'd hear her. The gesture, small as it was, made her throat tight. The following morning dawned cold and clear. Frost had painted intricate patterns across the windows, and Lila's breath misted in the early light. She rose carefully, testing her strength, and found it mostly returned. Her muscles were stiff but functional. The dizziness was gone. She dressed quickly and started the fire, moving through the familiar morning routine. By the time Silas emerged from the barn, she had coffee brewing and cornmeal mush bubbling in the pot. He stopped in the doorway, snowflakes dusting his shoulders, and something in his expression softened when he saw her up and working. "You look better," he said. "I feel better." She ladled mush into bowls. "I'm ready to get back to normal." "Normal," Silas repeated like he was testing the word. "All right, but you promised me something." Lila tensed. "What?" "You don't push yourself past breaking again. You need help. You ask for it. Deal?" It should have felt like a command. Instead, it felt like concern wrapped in a request. Like he was giving her the choice to take care of herself instead of forcing it on her. "Deal," she said. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. Lila took on more of the household work, but at a sustainable pace. She learned the quirks of the cast iron stove, figuring out which spots ran hot and which ran cool. She mastered the art of making bread that actually rose, dense and hearty, the kind that could soak up stew or fill an empty stomach on a cold morning. Her biscuits stopped resembling rocks and started resembling actual food. The chickens, she discovered, were not actually evil, just territorial and opinionated. Once she learned to approach them with confidence instead of fear, they settled down and even seemed to tolerate her presence. She gathered eggs without incident and found a strange satisfaction in the simple task. Silas, for his part, began to teach her things without fanfare. He showed her how to split kindling safely, where to strike the wood so it would cleave cleanly instead of splintering. He demonstrated the proper way to sharpen a knife, the angle of the blade against the whetstone, the rhythm of the motion. He taught her which tools lived where in the barn and what each one was for, speaking in his economical way, never using 3 words when one would do. "This is a draw knife," he'd say, holding up a curved blade with handles on each end. "For stripping bark. Pull toward you, not away." Or, "Throw and mallet, splitting shingles, hit here, not there." Lila absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge she'd never had access to before. In St. Louis, she'd known how to make beds and serve meals and stay invisible. Here, she was learning how to build things, how to fix things, how to survive. One afternoon in late November, she was sweeping the porch when a rider appeared at the edge of the property. Lila's hands tightened on the broom handle, old instincts screaming warnings. Strange men meant danger, always had. But Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his posture alert but not alarmed. "That's Henry Colfax," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Neighbor from 3 miles east. Good man." The rider, a weathered man in his 50s with a gray beard and kind eyes, pulled up and dismounted with a groan. "Silas, damn, but my back gets worse every winter." "Henry," Silas shook his hand. "What brings you out?" "Wanted to check how you're faring before the snow really hits. Road'll be impassable soon." Henry's gaze shifted to Lila, curiosity bright in his expression. "And I heard through the grapevine you had a new addition to the household." "Lila Mercer," Silas said. "Lila, this is Henry Colfax, runs cattle east of here." "Ma'am." Henry tipped his hat. "Pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," Lila managed, though her grip on the broom hadn't loosened. Henry seemed to sense her discomfort because he turned his attention back to Silas. "You need anything before winter sets in? I'm making a run to town next week. Last one before the passes close." "We're set," Silas said. "Stocked up last month." "Good, good." Henry accepted a cup of coffee and spent 20 minutes talking about cattle prices and weather predictions and a mountain lion someone had spotted near Miller's Creek. Then he tipped his hat again, mounted his horse, and rode off into the gathering dusk. When he was gone, Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You all right?" Silas asked. "Fine. Just not used to visitors. Henry's harmless. One of the few decent people in these parts." He paused. "But if anyone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me. I don't care who they are." Lila nodded, filing that promise away with all the others he'd made. Silas Boon, she was learning, was a man who meant what he said. December arrived with a vengeance. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, blanketing the farm in white silence. The temperature plummeted. Ice formed in the water bucket overnight. Silas spent long hours tending to the animals, making sure they had shelter and feed, breaking ice in the trough twice a day so they could drink. Lila kept the cabin warm and the meals regular, finding comfort in the routine. There was something deeply satisfying about having hot food ready when Silas came in from the cold, his face raw from the wind, snow crusted in his beard. He'd stamp his boots, shed his coat, and sink into the chair with a grateful nod that said more than words ever could. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of digging through snowdrifts to reach the barn, Silas sat by the fire trying to warm his hands. Lila noticed him flexing his fingers, wincing. "Let me see," she said, kneeling beside his chair. He hesitated, then held out his hands. They were chapped and cracked, the skin split in places from the cold and the rough work. "You should have said something," Lila scolded gently. She went to the shelf and retrieved the tin of salve he'd used on her burn weeks ago. "This will help." She took his right hand in both of hers and began working the salve into the damaged skin, her touch careful and deliberate. Silas went very still, watching her face instead of his hands. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. You did it for me, Lila replied, not looking up. Fair's fair. She finished with his right hand and moved to his left, smoothing the salve into the cracks and rough patches. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked every day of his life. But there was strength in them too, and a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she'd never expected to feel again. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something warm and careful, and maybe a little afraid. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. You're welcome. She stood and returned the tin to the shelf, her own hands trembling slightly. The moment had felt significant somehow, a crossing of some invisible line. She'd touched him, and he'd let her, and neither of them had flinched away. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, Lila realized she'd stopped checking the door to make sure it was locked, stopped sleeping in her clothes, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. She trusted him. Somehow, without meaning to, she'd started to trust Silas Boon. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it settled over her like the quilt, heavy and warm and surprisingly welcome. The week before Christmas, Silas surprised her. He came in from the barn carrying a small pine tree, its branches still dusted with snow. Thought we could use some green in here, he said, setting it in the corner. Make the place feel less bleak. Lila stared at him. You cut down a tree? Just a small one. Plenty more where it came from. He brushed snow off his shoulders. My mother used to do this, said even in the hardest winters, you needed something growing in the house, something alive. The gesture, so unexpected and thoughtful, made Lila's eyes burn. I don't have anything to decorate it with. Don't need much. Silas pulled a bag from his coat pocket and dumped its contents on the table. Dried berries, pine cones, scraps of red ribbon. Figured we could make do with what we have. They spent the evening stringing berries and tying ribbons, working in companionable silence. Silas's large fingers fumbled with the delicate work, and more than once Lila found herself biting back a smile at his concentrated frown. What? He asked, catching her expression. Nothing. You look very serious about those berries. They keep falling off the damn string, he muttered, but there was no real frustration in it. When they finished, the little tree stood in the corner, humble but cheerful, catching the firelight. It wasn't much, but it transformed the cabin into something that felt like a home instead of just a shelter. It's beautiful, Lila said softly. It's lopsided, Silas countered, but he was looking at the tree with something like satisfaction. But I suppose it'll do. That night, Lila pulled her carpet bag from under the bed and dug through it until she found the small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was the only thing of value she owned, a silver thimble that had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through women who'd had nothing else to give. She'd been saving it, thinking maybe one day she'd need to sell it. But looking at it now, in the firelight, with the little tree standing guard in the corner, she knew what she wanted to do with it. She spent the next week working in secret, unpicking the hem of one of Silas's old shirts and using the fabric to make something new. Her fingers remembered the stitches her grandmother had taught her years ago, before everything fell apart. The work was slow and painstaking, but it gave her something to focus on during the long winter afternoons. On Christmas Eve, snow fell soft and steady outside. Silas had brought in extra firewood, and the cabin was warm and bright. After supper, Lila pulled the small wrapped bundle from her apron pocket and set it on the table in front of him. What's this? Silas asked, eyeing it warily. It's Christmas tomorrow. Open it. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, like he was afraid of damaging it, and pulled out what she'd made, a simple handkerchief, hemmed with neat stitches, with his initials embroidered in one corner. Silas stared at it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the letters. You made this? It's not much, Lila said, suddenly nervous. I used fabric from an old shirt. I hope you don't mind. I just thought, it's perfect. He looked up at her, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been emotion. Nobody's given me a Christmas gift since my mother died. Thank you. Lila felt her cheeks warm. You're welcome. Silas stood and went to the trunk in the corner, pulling out a package wrapped in brown paper. I have something for you, too. You didn't have to. Open it. Lila unwrapped the paper with trembling hands and found a beautiful woolen shawl, soft and warm, dyed a deep forest green. It was the kind of thing she would never have bought for herself. Too fine, too expensive. Silas, this is too much. It's cold here. Colder than St. Louis, I'd wager. You need something warm. He cleared his throat. Besides, I saw you looking at it when we were in town last month. Figured you liked it. He'd noticed. He'd paid attention to what she wanted and remembered it weeks later. The realization made her chest ache. It's beautiful, she whispered, wrapping it around her shoulders. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. They sat by the fire that night, the snow falling outside and the little tree keeping watch. And for the first time in her life, Lila understood what peace felt like. But peace, she was about to learn, was a fragile thing. The trouble started 3 days after Christmas. Lila was in the henhouse collecting eggs when she heard voices outside. Male voices, rough and unfamiliar. She froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Boon!" one of them shouted. "We know you're here!" Lila crept to the door and peered out. 2 men sat on horseback in the yard, and even from a distance she could tell they weren't friendly visitors like Henry Colfax. These men had hard faces and cruel mouths, the kind of men she'd learned to avoid back in St. Louis. Silas emerged from his barn, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "What do you want, Garrett?" The larger of the 2 men, Garrett, apparently, grinned without humor. "Heard you got yourself a woman, Boon. Thought we'd come see if it was true." "And now you've seen. You can leave." "Now hold on, don't be unfriendly." Garrett's companion, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "We just want to meet the lady. Make sure she's being treated right." "She's fine. You're leaving." "Heard she came through the arrangement company," Garrett continued, ignoring him. "That means she was desperate, Boon. Desperate women don't last long out here. Gets lonely, gets cold. Sometimes they need company." The implication was clear and vile. Lila's stomach turned. Silas's voice, when it came, was absolutely flat. "Get off my property." "Or what?" The scarred man laughed. "You'll shoot us? For making conversation?" "I'll do what needs doing," Silas said, and there was something in his tone that made both men shift in their saddles. "This is the only warning you get. Leave. Don't come back." Garrett's grin faded. "You're making a mistake, Boon." "The only mistake is you 2 still sitting there." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett spat into the snow and yanked his horse's head around. "Let's go. This ain't worth the trouble." They rode off, but the scarred man looked back over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the yard until they landed on the henhouse. On Lila. She ducked back inside, her breath coming fast and shallow, old panic clawing at her throat. When she finally emerged, Silas was standing in the yard, watching the direction the riders had gone. His hands were clenched at his sides. "You can come out," he said, without turning around. "They're gone." Lila approached slowly, still clutching the egg basket. Who were they? Drifters. The kind who cause trouble wherever they go. He turned to face her, and his expression was grim. "Garrett's been run out of 2 towns for theft and assault. The other one, Cutter, they call him, is worse. They winter in these parts sometimes, taking what they want from people who can't fight back. Will they come back?" "Maybe." Silas's jaw tightened. "But if they do, they'll regret it." That night, he didn't prepare his bedroll by the fire. Instead, he sat in the chair beside the door with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness outside. "You should sleep," Lila said from the bed. "I'll sleep when I know they're gone for good." "Silas, go to sleep, Lila." But she couldn't sleep. Not with him sitting there like a sentinel, not with the memory of those men's voices still echoing in her head. She lay awake for hours, watching his silhouette against the dying fire, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. She woke once in the deep hours of the night and saw him still there, still watching, still keeping guard. And despite the fear that had wrapped around her heart, she felt something else too. Something that made her throat tight and her eyes burn. He was protecting her. Not because he owned her or because he expected something in return, but because he'd promised she'd be safe under his roof. And Silas Boon kept his promises. The days that followed were tense. Silas kept his rifle close and his eyes on the horizon. He made sure Lila stayed near the cabin, and when he had to work the far pasture, he insisted she lock the door behind him. "I don't like this," Lila told him one morning as he prepared to leave. "I don't like you treating me like I'm made of glass." "I'm treating you like someone worth protecting," Silas said. "There's a difference. I can take care of myself." "I know you can." He looked at her steadily. "But you shouldn't have to. Not alone. Not anymore." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. "How long?" Lila asked. "How long do we live like this?" "Until I'm sure they're gone, or until I make sure they don't come back." "What does that mean?" But Silas just shook his head. "Lock the door. I'll be back before dark." He left, and Lila did as he asked, sliding the heavy bar into place. Then she sat by the window, the small revolver Silas had given her the night before resting in her lap, and watched the empty yard. The snow fell, the wind howled, and Lila waited, her heart a tight fist in her chest, for whatever came next. 3 days passed without incident, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it coiled tighter with each quiet hour, like a spring being compressed to its breaking point. Silas worked the farm with mechanical efficiency, but Lila noticed the changes. He no longer whistled tunelessly while chopping wood. He checked the perimeter of the property twice each morning and again before dark. The rifle that used to hang above the door now leaned against the wall within arm's reach, loaded and ready. And at night, he still didn't sleep by the fire. He sat in that chair by the door, keeping watch, his face drawn with exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. On the 4th morning, Lila had had enough. "You can't keep this up," she said, setting his coffee down harder than necessary. "You haven't slept properly in days. You're going to collapse." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground." She crossed her arms. "Those men are probably 50 miles from here by now. You said yourself they're drifters." "Drifters circle back," Silas said, his voice flat. "Like wolves. They test your defenses, see where you're weak, then they return when you've let your guard down." "So what's your plan? Sit in that chair for the rest of winter?" He looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "If that's what it takes." "Silas, you don't understand." He set down his cup, his jaw working. "Men like Garrett and Cutter, they don't just want to steal supplies or cattle. They want to break things, break people. And women out here—" He stopped, struggling with words. "Women are vulnerable, especially women who came from arrangement companies. There's a certain kind of man who sees that as an invitation." The way he said it made Lila's skin crawl because she knew he was right. She'd seen that look before, in St. Louis, in the eyes of men who thought desperate meant available. "I know what kind of men they are," she said quietly. "Better than you think." Silas studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "Then you know why I can't let my guard down. I also know you can't protect me if you're dead on your feet." She moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "We'll take turns. You sleep for a few hours during the day. I'll keep watch. Then you can take over at night." Lila, "I can shoot," she interrupted. "You gave me that revolver and showed me how to use it. I'm not helpless, and I'm tired of you treating me like I am." The muscle in his jaw twitched. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm trying to keep you safe." The words burst out of him, rough and ragged. "I brought you here. I took responsibility for you. If something happens to you because I wasn't careful enough, because I let my guard down for one damn minute—" He stopped, dragging a hand through his hair. "I can't let that happen." The raw emotion in his voice stunned her into silence. This wasn't just about duty or responsibility. This was personal. This was fear. "Nothing is going to happen to me," Lila said, gentler now. "But something will happen to you if you keep this up. And then where will I be?" That got through to him. She saw the moment the logic penetrated his exhaustion-fogged brain. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. "All right," he said finally. "We'll take turns. But you wake me if you see anything. Anything at all." "I will." "And you keep the revolver with you. Always." "I will," she repeated. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and the gratitude in his expression made her chest ache. "Thank you." "Go sleep," Lila said. "I'll wake you in 4 hours." He nodded and stood, swaying slightly. For a moment she thought he might argue, might insist on staying awake. Instead, he crossed to the bed and lay down fully clothed, not even bothering to remove his boots. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the heavy rhythm of true sleep. Lila took up position in the chair by the door, the revolver in her lap, and watched the winter morning brighten beyond the frosted windows. The world outside was still and white and beautiful. It was hard to believe danger could exist in something so peaceful. But she'd learned long ago that danger wore many faces. Sometimes it was loud and violent. Sometimes it was quiet and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She wouldn't let it strike here. Not at this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness. Not at this fragile thing they were building between them. The hours passed slowly. Lila split her attention between the window and Silas, watching his chest rise and fall, cataloging the small details she'd never let herself notice before. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the faint scar on his left hand, a white line across the knuckles, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He looked younger in sleep, the hard lines of worry smoothed away. She wondered what he'd been like before life had taught him to be so careful, so guarded. Had he laughed easily? Smiled often? Or had his father's cruelty stolen that from him before he'd ever had a chance to be young? The questions circled in her mind, unanswerable but persistent. When 4 hours had passed, she almost didn't wake him. He needed more sleep, needed days of it. But she'd made a promise, and Lila Mercer kept her promises now too. She crossed to the bed and touched his shoulder gently. Silas. He came awake instantly, his hand reaching for the rifle that wasn't there before his eyes even opened. Then he saw her and exhaled sharply. Easy, Lila said. Everything's quiet, nothing to report. He sat up, scrubbing a hand over his face. What time is it? Just past noon. You slept 4 hours, like I said. Feels like I just closed my eyes. But his voice was stronger, the fog of exhaustion lifting slightly. There's stew from yesterday on the stove. You should eat. They traded places, Silas moving to the window while Lila heated the stew. They ate together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Easier, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold into partnership. That night, after Silas had taken over the watch and Lila had retreated to the bed, she lay awake listening to him move around the cabin. The soft creak of the chair, the quiet sound of him checking the rifle, the whisper of fabric as he adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. She felt safer with him there, standing guard between her and the dark. But she also felt something else, something warm and frightening and completely unfamiliar. She was starting to care about Silas Boon, not as a protector or a provider, but as a man, as someone whose pain mattered to her, whose safety mattered. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it settled over her like the quilt, heavy and warm, and pulled her down into sleep. A week passed. Then another. January arrived with bitter cold and howling winds that piled snow against the cabin walls. The world contracted to the small circle of firelight, the daily rhythms of survival. Silas and Lila moved around each other with growing ease, their routines interlocking like fingers clasping. The threat of Garrett and Cutter faded into background noise. Not gone, never truly gone, but distant enough that they could breathe again. Lila found herself actually enjoying the work now. She'd stopped seeing it as proof of her worth and started seeing it as contribution, as partnership. When she baked bread, it wasn't to avoid punishment, it was because Silas needed to eat, and she wanted to feed him something good. When she mended his shirts, it wasn't obligation, it was care. The distinction mattered more than she'd expected. One afternoon, while Silas was out breaking ice in the cattle trough, Lila decided to tackle the garden project again. Not with the desperate, punishing intensity of before, but methodically, carefully. She spread the book on plants across the kitchen table and studied it, making notes about what to plant when spring came, how to prepare the soil, which herbs would grow well in Montana's short season. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear Silas come in until he spoke. Planning something? Lila looked up, startled. I thought you were with the cattle. Finished early. He moved to stand beside her, looking down at the book. What are you working on? The garden. I want to do it right this time. She pointed to her notes. I was thinking potatoes here because they're hardy, and beans, they fix nitrogen in the soil, which helps other plants grow. And there's a section on medicinal herbs that might be useful. Yarrow for wounds, feverfew for headaches, chamomile for... She stopped, realizing she was rambling, but when she looked up, Silas was smiling. Actually smiling, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just, you're excited about it. It's good to see." Lila felt her cheeks warm. "It's just a garden." "It's your garden," Silas corrected. "Your project. That makes it more than just a garden." The words wrapped around something soft and vulnerable in her chest. "You really think we can make it work?" "I think if anyone can coax food out of this stubborn ground, it's you." He paused. "You're tougher than you give yourself credit for, Lila Mercer." She wanted to argue, to list all the ways she was broken and inadequate, but the certainty in his voice stopped her. He believed it. He actually believed she was strong. Maybe, she thought, she could try to believe it too. That night the wind picked up to a scream. Snow battered the windows and found every crack in the walls, sending icy drafts across the floor. The fire roared in the hearth, but even its heat couldn't quite chase away the cold. Lila burrowed under the quilt, her teeth chattering. She heard Silas add more wood to the fire, heard him move around the cabin checking for drafts. Then the bed dipped slightly as he sat on the edge. "You all right?" he asked. "Just cold." He was quiet for a moment. "The temperature's dropping fast, could hit 20 below tonight." Lila knew what he wasn't saying. At 20 below, the fire might not be enough. People froze to death in their own beds during Montana winters. It happened more often than anyone liked to admit. "You should take the bed," she said. "You need to stay warm too." "I'm fine by the fire." "Silas, the bed's warmer. You stay there." She sat up, frustration overriding her shivers. "This is ridiculous. The bed is big enough for 2 people. We're both adults. We can share it without..." She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Without what?" "Without it meaning anything," Lila finished quietly. "I trust you. You've proven I can trust you, so stop sleeping on the floor like you're being punished and just share the bed, please." The silence stretched between them, taut and trembling. "You're sure?" Silas asked finally, his voice rough. "I'm sure." He stood and added more wood to the fire, banking it for the night. Then he removed his boots and lay down on top of the quilt on the far side of the bed, as far from her as the narrow space allowed. He kept his back to her, his body rigid with the effort of maintaining distance. "You can get under the quilt," Lila said. "You'll freeze otherwise." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're being stubborn." She tugged at the quilt. "Get under. I mean it." With obvious reluctance, Silas shifted and pulled the quilt over himself, but he stayed on his side, a careful line of space between them. Lila lay in the darkness, hyper-aware of his presence. She could hear his breathing, steady and controlled, could feel the warmth radiating from his body, so close but not touching. The bed that had felt enormous when she slept alone now seemed impossibly small. "Thank you," Silas said into the darkness, "for trusting me." "Thank you for being worth trusting," Lila whispered back. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature plummeted. But inside the cabin, wrapped in wool and warmed by the fire, they were safe. Together. Lila closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and for the first time since she was a child, she didn't sleep alone. Morning came gray and bitter. When Lila woke, Silas was already up, rebuilding the fire. The place where he'd slept beside her still held the faint warmth of his body. Something had shifted in the night. She could feel it in the way he glanced at her while making coffee, in the careful way she moved around the cabin. They'd crossed another threshold, one that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd shared a bed. Innocently, out of necessity, but it mattered. It changed things. Over breakfast, Silas cleared his throat. "About last night." "It's fine," Lila said quickly. "It was practical, that's all." "Right, practical." But he didn't sound convinced. They didn't speak of it again. But that night, when the temperature dropped again, Silas didn't hesitate before climbing into the bed beside her, and the night after that, and the one after that. It became their new routine. They shared the bed like siblings, maintaining a careful distance, never touching. But Lila found herself sleeping better than she had in years, the sound of his breathing a comfort in the dark. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was lying. 2 weeks into January, Henry Colfax appeared again, riding through snow that came up to his horse's knees. "Road's finally passable," he called out as Silas emerged from the barn. "Wanted to check you hadn't frozen to death." "We're managing," Silas said. Henry dismounted and followed him inside, stomping snow from his boots. His eyes swept the cabin and landed on Lila with a knowing gleam. "Miss Mercer, you're looking well." "Thank you, Mr. Colfax." "Henry, please." He accepted the coffee Silas offered and settled into the chair. "I came to warn you, actually. Garrett and Cutter were spotted near Miller's Creek 3 days ago. Looks like they're still in the area." Lila's hands stilled on the dishcloth. Silas's expression went flat and dangerous. "What were they doing?" he asked. "Causing trouble at the saloon. Got into a fight with some miners. Sheriff ran them off, but they headed east." Henry paused. "Toward your property." "How many days ago?" 3. Like I said. Could be they passed right by. Could be they're still out there." Henry's gaze was serious. "Watch yourself, Silas. Those two are mean as snakes and twice as poisonous." After Henry left, the tension that had eased over the past weeks came roaring back. Silas checked the rifle, counted ammunition, reinforced the bar on the door. His movements were sharp and controlled, but Lila could see the worry beneath. "Maybe they did pass by," she offered. "Maybe they're already gone." "Maybe." But Silas didn't sound convinced. That night he didn't come to bed. He sat in the chair by the door, rifle across his lap, eyes on the darkness outside. Lila lay awake for hours, watching his silhouette, before exhaustion finally claimed her. She woke to the sound of horses. For a moment, still fogged with sleep, she thought she'd dreamed it. Then she heard it again, the crunch of hooves in snow, the jingle of tack, and voices. Low and rough and far too close. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She sat up and saw Silas already on his feet, rifle in hand, his face carved from stone. "Stay in the bed," he said quietly. "Don't make a sound." "Silas." "Stay down!" A fist pounded on the door, making Lila jump. "Boon, we know you're in there," Garrett's voice slurred with drink. "Come on out and be neighborly." Silas didn't answer. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. "We just want to talk," Cutter's voice this time, mocking. "About that arrangement you got. The pretty little thing you're keeping." Lila's stomach turned to ice. "We've been thinking," Garrett continued. "A woman like that, she must get lonely. Might want some variety. We could help with that." Crude laughter followed. Lila pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. Silas's hands tightened on the rifle until his knuckles went white. When he spoke, his voice carried through the door cold and final as winter itself. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my property. After that, I start shooting." The laughter died. "That's unfriendly, Boon," Garrett said, but there was an edge to his voice now. "Real unfriendly." 10, Silas said. 9. "You threatening us?" 8, 7. "You can't guard her forever," Cutter called out. "Sooner or later you'll slip up, and when you do..." 6, 5. Lila heard movement outside, horses shifting, men muttering to each other. "This ain't over," Garrett snarled. 4, 3. "We'll be back, Boon, and next time..." The crack of the rifle shot split the night. Lila flinched violently, her ears ringing. Through the ringing she heard shouting, the thunder of horses bolting, receding hoofbeats. Then silence. Silas stood at the window, the rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His chest heaved with controlled breaths. "Did you hit them?" Lila whispered. "Shot over their heads." He lowered the rifle slowly. "Wanted them to know I meant it." "Will they come back?" Silas turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was absolutely implacable. "If they do, I won't miss." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Silas kept watch while Lila huddled in the bed, the revolver clutched in her shaking hands. Dawn came pale and cold, revealing an empty yard and tracks in the snow leading east. They were gone. For now. But the threat lingered like smoke, acrid and choking. Over the following days, Silas barely slept. He patrolled the property with the rifle, checking and rechecking the approaches. He nailed boards across the shutters, reinforced the door, set up rudimentary alarms, pots and pans on strings that would clatter if someone approached. Lila watched him transform into someone she barely recognized. The quiet, careful farmer disappeared, replaced by something harder, something dangerous. On the third night, she found him sitting by the fire cleaning the rifle for the dozenth time, his movements mechanical and precise. "You need to rest," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't slept in 3 days. You barely eat. You're running yourself into the ground again, and this time I don't think you'll get back up." "They threatened you." His voice was flat, emotionless. "They said they'd come back for you." "I know what they said." "Then you know why I can't rest." Lila crossed the room and knelt in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. You've done everything you can. The cabin is secure. We have weapons. We have warning systems. You can't do more than that without killing yourself. If something happens to you, nothing is going to happen to me," Lila said fiercely, "because you're here, because you're careful, because you're the strongest, most stubborn man I've ever met, and if anyone can keep us safe, it's you." Silas stared at her, and slowly, something in his expression cracked. The iron control wavered. His shoulders sagged. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words barely audible. "I haven't been scared like this since I was a boy hiding from my father's fists. But this is worse, because it's not me in danger, it's you." The raw honesty of it broke something open in Lila's chest. She reached up and took his face in her hands, feeling the rough scratch of his beard against her palms. "I'm scared too," she said. "But I'm also tired of being scared, tired of letting fear control everything. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to put down that rifle, you're going to eat something, and you're going to sleep. And I'm going to keep watch, and if anything happens, I'll wake you. Do you trust me?" "With my life," Silas said without hesitation. "Then trust me with this." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Lila made him eat a bowl of stew, made him drink water. Then she guided him to the bed and stood over him until he lay down. 4 hours, he said. "You wake me in 4 hours." "I will." She took up position in the chair by the door, the rifle across her lap, and watched the winter night deepen beyond the window. The darkness pressed against the glass, vast and unknowable. Somewhere out there, Garrett and Cutter were planning, scheming, waiting for their chance. But they wouldn't get it. Not while she had breath in her body. Lila Mercer had spent her whole life being afraid, being small, being someone things happened to instead of someone who made things happen. Not anymore. If they came back, they'd find out what happened when you threatened the only safe place she'd ever known. When you tried to take away the only person who'd ever made her feel like she mattered. They'd find out she was done being a victim. 4 hours passed, then 6. Silas slept on, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Lila let him sleep, kept her vigil, and felt something hard and bright crystallize in her chest. She belonged here, in this cabin, on this farm, with this man, and she would fight to keep it. When Silas finally woke, daylight was streaming through the gaps in the shuttered windows, and Lila was still in the chair, the rifle steady across her lap, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion pulling at her features. He sat up abruptly, disoriented. "How long did I sleep?" 8 hours, Lila said without apology. "You said 4. You needed 8. She stood and stretched, her back cracking audibly. Nothing happened. No movement, no sounds except the wind and a coyote around dawn. Silas dragged a hand through his hair, torn between gratitude and frustration. "You should have woken me. You would have done the same for me." Lila set the rifle aside carefully. "Now it's my turn to sleep. Wake me if you need me." She crossed to the bed and lay down still fully dressed, her eyes closing almost before her head hit the pillow. Within moments, her breathing deepened into sleep. Silas watched her for a long minute, something tight and unfamiliar moving in his chest. She'd kept watch all night. This woman who'd arrived frightened and broken had stood guard over him while he slept, protecting him the way he'd been protecting her. Partnership, he thought. This was what it meant. Not one person carrying all the weight, but two people sharing the burden, taking turns holding each other up. He moved quietly around the cabin, rebuilding the fire and making coffee. Through the window, he could see fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the tracks from 3 days ago. The world looked clean and new, like it was offering them a fresh start. But Silas knew better than to trust appearances. He spent the morning reinforcing what he'd already reinforced, checking traps he'd set around the property's perimeter. Simple things. Tripwires strung with bells, carefully placed branches that would snap underfoot. Nothing that would stop determined men, but enough to give warning. By the time Lila woke in the early afternoon, he had a plan forming. "We can't keep living like this," he said without preamble when she emerged from sleep, her hair mussed and her eyes still heavy. Jumping at every sound, taking turns sleeping. This isn't living, it's just surviving. Lila poured herself coffee and sat at the table. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm going to town tomorrow, going to talk to the sheriff, file a formal complaint. Get it on record that Garrett and Cutter threatened us." "Will that help?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Probably not. Sheriff's got jurisdiction over the town, not the back country, but it's something, and I'm going to spread the word at the general store, the saloon, anywhere men gather. Let it be known that anyone who comes near this property uninvited will be met with force." "That sounds like a good way to make enemies." "I already have enemies. Might as well make sure everyone else knows to stay clear." He paused. "I want you to come with me." Lila looked up sharply. "To town? It's safer than leaving you here alone, and—" he struggled with the words. "I want people to see you with me. Want them to know you're under my protection. That might count for something." The idea of being displayed like property made Lila's stomach clench, but she understood what he wasn't saying. In this rough country, a woman alone was vulnerable. A woman attached to a man who'd fight for her had at least some measure of safety. "All right," she said. "I'll come." They left before dawn the next morning, the wagon creaking through snow-packed ruts in the road. The journey took 3 hours, the cold seeping through Lila's shawl despite the thick wool. Silas drove in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, the rifle within easy reach. When they finally reached town, the sun was high and weak in a pale sky. The settlement wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a smithy, and a handful of other buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few horses stood hitched outside the saloon despite the early hour. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the sheriff's office and helped Lila down. His hand on her elbow was steady and warm, and he kept himself positioned between her and the street as they climbed the steps. The sheriff was a grizzled man in his 50s with tobacco-stained teeth and shrewd eyes. He looked up from his desk when they entered, his gaze moving from Silas to Lila and back again. "Boon, what brings you to town?" "Need to file a complaint, Sheriff Morrison. 2 men came onto my property 3 nights ago making threats. Garrett and Cutter." Morrison's expression soured. "Those 2? What kind of threats?" "The kind that involve my household," Silas said carefully, not looking at Lila. "They were drunk and aggressive. I fired a warning shot to drive them off." "They hurt anyone?" "No." "They steal anything?" "No, but—" "Then there's not much I can do, Boon." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You fired them off your property. Sounds like you handled it. I want it on record that they threatened us. In case they come back. I'll make a note of it." But Morrison's tone suggested the note would be filed and forgotten. "Though I'll tell you what I tell everyone. Out where you are, you're on your own. Law doesn't reach much past town limits. You have trouble, you deal with it yourself." Silas's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained level. "Then I'm giving you notice, Sheriff. Anyone comes on my property making threats, I'll deal with them. Permanently, if necessary." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "That's your right, I suppose. Just make sure they're actually on your property when you do it. Otherwise it's murder, and that I do have jurisdiction over." They left the office with nothing accomplished and a cold knot of anger in Silas's gut. Lila could feel the tension radiating off him as they walked toward the general store. Inside, the proprietor, a thin man named Hastings, greeted them with the wary politeness reserved for customers who bought in bulk. Silas placed an order for supplies they'd need before spring: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition. Heard you had some trouble out your way, Hastings said as he tallied the order, his voice carefully neutral. Word traveled fast in small towns. Silas met his gaze squarely. Nothing I couldn't handle. But I want folks to know anyone comes near my place uninvited, I'll assume they're there for trouble. Hastings nodded slowly. I'll pass that along. While Silas settled the bill, Lila wandered the aisles, studying goods she couldn't afford but could dream about. Fabric for new curtains, a proper set of dishes, seeds for the garden. See something you want? She turned to find Silas beside her, his expression softer than it had been in the sheriff's office. Just looking, she said. He reached past her and picked up a packet of seeds. Carrots, the label said. Then another, beans, squash, lettuce. For the garden, he said, adding them to their supplies. Spring's not far off. You'll need these. Lila's throat tightened. Silas, you don't have to. I want to. He met her eyes. It's your garden. You should have what you need to make it work. The simple gesture, the acknowledgement that her project mattered, made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed in public. Thank you, she whispered. They loaded the supplies into the wagon and were preparing to leave when a voice called out behind them. Well, well, if it isn't the homesteader and his bought woman. Lila froze. She knew that voice, knew the mocking cruelty in it. Silas turned slowly, his hand moving to rest on the rifle. Garrett and Cutter stood outside the saloon, both clearly drunk despite the early afternoon hour. Garrett's face was flushed, his eyes mean and bright. Thought that was your wagon, Garrett continued, swaggering closer. Wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding the other night. There was no misunderstanding, Silas said, his voice flat. You threatened my household. I drove you off. Stay off my property and we won't have a problem. Ah, don't be like that, Cutter grinned, showing missing teeth. We were just being friendly, trying to welcome the lady proper-like. The lady doesn't want your welcome. Maybe we should ask her. Garrett's gaze slid to Lila, making her skin crawl. What about it, sweetheart? You happy with what you got? Or you looking for something a little more exciting? Lila wanted to disappear, wanted to hide behind Silas and let him handle this. But something hard and bright that had been growing in her chest since that night on watch flared to life. She stepped forward, out from behind Silas's protective bulk, and met Garrett's eyes directly. I'm exactly where I want to be, she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. With a man who treats me with respect. Something neither of you would know anything about. Garrett's grin faltered. Cutter's expression darkened. Careful, woman, Cutter said softly. You're making assumptions about things you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Lila felt Silas tense beside her, but didn't back down. I understand you're the kind of men who get their courage from a bottle and prey on people weaker than you. I understand you're cowards who travel in pairs because neither of you is brave enough to stand alone. And I understand that if you come near me or my home again, you'll regret it. For a moment, shocked silence hung in the air. Then Garrett's face flushed an ugly red. You little... Silas moved faster than Lila had ever seen him move, putting himself between her and Garrett, the rifle coming up in one smooth motion. That's enough, he said, and his voice was absolutely void of emotion. You've been warned, twice. There won't be a third time. Sheriff Morrison appeared on the steps of his office, drawn by the commotion. There a problem here? No problem, Silas said without lowering the rifle. These men were just leaving. Garrett and Cutter exchanged a look. Then Garrett spat into the snow and turned away. Enjoy her while you can, Boon, he called over his shoulder. Everything that can be bought can be taken. Silas didn't respond. He kept the rifle raised until both men had mounted their horses and ridden out of town. Then, slowly, he lowered it and turned to Lila. That was brave, he said quietly. Also incredibly foolish. I'm tired of being quiet, Lila said, her hands shaking now that the moment had passed. Tired of letting men like that make me feel small. I understand that, but Lila... He stopped, struggling with something. You don't have to prove anything. Not to them. Not to me. You're already the strongest person I know. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Before she could respond, Silas was helping her into the wagon, his movements gentle despite the tension still vibrating through him. They rode out of town in silence, but Lila's mind was racing. She'd stood up to them. She'd found her voice and used it, and the world hadn't ended. Silas hadn't been angry or ashamed. If anything, he'd been proud. The realization settled over her like sunrise, warming places that had been cold for so long. The journey home took longer than the journey out, the horses tired and the snow starting to fall again. By the time they reached the farm, dusk was gathering and the temperature was dropping fast. Silas unhitched the wagon and tended to the horses while Lila carried supplies into the cabin. They worked in their usual efficient partnership, each knowing what needed to be done without discussion. But underneath the routine, something had changed. The confrontation in town had stripped away another layer of pretense, forced them both to acknowledge what they'd been dancing around for weeks. They were building something here. Something that mattered, something worth fighting for. After supper, Silas sat at the table cleaning the rifle while Lila washed dishes. The silence between them felt heavy, weighted with unspoken words. "I meant what I said," Lila finally broke it. "In town. I'm exactly where I want to be." Silas's hand stilled on the rifle. "Even after everything? The threats, the danger, the isolation? Even after all of that?" She dried her hands and turned to face him. "I spent my whole life feeling like I was invisible. Like I didn't matter, like I was just taking up space that someone else deserved more. But here," she gestured to the cabin, to him, to the life they'd been building. "Here I matter. I contribute. I belong." "You always mattered," Silas said roughly, "long before you got here. You just needed someone to see it." "You saw it. I saw you." He set the rifle aside and stood, crossing to stand in front of her. "Not some arrangement company contract. Not some woman I bought passage for. You, Lila Mercer, who's tougher than nails and braver than any man I've known. Who burns bread and cusses at chickens and makes me laugh even when I don't mean to. Who kept watch all night so I could sleep. Who stood up to men twice her size because she was tired of being afraid." His words washed over her, each one a revelation. "I make you laugh?" A smile tugged at his mouth. "When you're not looking, yeah." "I've never heard you laugh." "I'm out of practice." His expression sobered. "My whole life, I learned to be careful. To guard everything. My words, my actions, my feelings. Thought if I could just stay controlled enough, stay careful enough, nothing bad could touch me. But you?" He shook his head. "You make me want to stop being so damn careful all the time." Lila's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I care about you. More than I should. More than is probably wise." His gray eyes held hers, unflinching. "I'm saying when those men threatened you, I would have killed them without hesitation. I'm saying I don't want you here because of some arrangement or contract. I want you here because I can't imagine this place without you anymore." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. "I care about you too," Lila whispered. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But I do." Silas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his rough, work-worn hand. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, gentle despite the calluses. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "I swear on everything I am, I won't ever hurt you." "I know." And she did. She knew it bone deep, knew it the way she knew her own name. "I trust you." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. They stood like that for a long moment, not quite kissing, but closer than they'd ever been, crossing a threshold neither of them could name, but both understood. Then Silas pulled back, his hand dropping away. "It's late. We should sleep." Lila nodded, not trusting her voice. They prepared for bed in their usual routine, but everything felt different now, charged. When they lay down on opposite sides of the bed, the careful distance between them felt like a canyon. Lila lay in the darkness, hyper-aware of every breath he took, every small movement. Her whole body hummed with awareness, with want, with something she was afraid to name. "Lila?" Silas's voice came soft through the dark. "Yes?" "Are you all right? With what I said?" "I'm more than all right." She paused. "Are you?" "Terrified," he admitted. "But yeah, I'm all right." She smiled into the darkness. "Good." Sleep was a long time coming, but when it finally arrived, it was deep and dreamless and peaceful. The next morning broke clear and cold. Lila woke to find Silas already up, standing at the window and staring out at something she couldn't see. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up. "Snow stopped during the night. I can see tracks. Someone was here." Her blood went cold. "Garrett and Cutter?" "Don't know yet." He grabbed the rifle and moved toward the door. "Stay inside. Bar the door behind me." "Silas, wait." But he was already outside, the door closing behind him. Lila scrambled out of bed and did as he'd asked, sliding the heavy bar into place. Then she grabbed the revolver and positioned herself by the window where she could see out. Silas moved across the yard with the rifle ready, following tracks that led from the tree line to the barn and back. He disappeared inside the barn for what felt like an eternity. When he emerged, his face was grim. He returned to the cabin and Lila unbarred the door, her hands shaking. "Someone was in the barn last night," he said. "Looked through our supplies. Didn't take anything, just looked." "Why would they do that?" "To let us know they can reach us whenever they want." Silas set the rifle down, his jaw tight. "They're playing with us, trying to scare us." "It's working," Lila admitted. "I know." He looked at her, and the fury in his eyes was banked but burning. "But I'm done playing, done waiting for them to make the next move." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to end this." His voice was flat, final. "One way or another, I'm going to make sure they never come back." The determination in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had in days, because she knew Silas Boon didn't make threats he couldn't keep. If he said he would end this, he would, no matter what it took. They spent the day preparing. Silas checked and rechecked every weapon, counted ammunition, reinforced every entry point. Lila helped where she could, her own determination hardening into something cold and bright. That night they didn't sleep. They sat together by the fire, weapons within reach, waiting. The storm came just before midnight. Not a weather storm, though wind had picked up and snow was starting to fall again, but the storm they'd been anticipating. The rattle of the alarm bells strung around the property shattered the silence, sharp and urgent. Silas was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "They're here!" Lila grabbed the revolver, her heart pounding but her hands steady. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Stay back from the door." The bells fell silent. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch, deliberate and unhurried. "Boon!" Garrett's voice slurred and mean. "Come on out. Let's settle this like men." Silas didn't answer. "We know you're in there, saw your lamp burning. You and that woman of yours, all cozy by the fire." Cutter this time, his voice mocking. "Maybe we'll join you, get warm, have a drink, get to know the lady better." Lila's stomach churned with revulsion and fear, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think. They were trying to provoke Silas into doing something rash. "Silas," she whispered, "don't let them bait you." He glanced at her, and the look in his eyes was absolutely cold. "I'm not. I'm just deciding where to put the first shot." A crash came from the side of the cabin, something heavy thrown against the wall. Then another from the back. They were circling the building, testing for weaknesses. "Last chance, Boon!" Garrett shouted. "Come out and talk or we come in. Your choice." Silas moved to the door and shouted back, his voice carrying clear and hard. "You're on my property making threats. I'm within my rights to defend it. You've got one chance to leave. Take it." Harsh laughter answered him. "That's not how this works. See? We've decided we want what you have. That nice farm, those supplies in the barn, and that pretty little thing you're keeping, so you can hand it all over peaceful-like, or we can take it. Makes no difference to us." Silas's hands tightened on the rifle. Lila saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, saw him weighing options and discarding them. "Silas," she said quietly, "what are we going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he made his decision. "We fight." The word hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Lila's grip tightened on the revolver, her palms slick with sweat despite the cold. Outside, she could hear Garrett and Cutter moving around the cabin, their boots crunching in the snow, testing the shutters, looking for a way in. Silas moved to the corner where he'd stacked extra ammunition and began loading his pockets with cartridges. His movements were calm and methodical, like he was preparing for a day's work instead of a fight that might end with them both dead. "Listen to me carefully," he said without looking at her. "I'm going to open that door and step out onto the porch. They'll focus on me, which gives you the advantage." "What advantage?" "Silas, you can't just... You're going to stay at the window with the revolver. If either of them tries to come through a window or the back door while I'm dealing with the front, you shoot. Don't hesitate, don't warn them, just shoot. Understand?" Lila's throat was so tight she could barely force out the words. "I can't let you go out there alone." "You're not letting me do anything. This is my choice." He finally looked at her, and his expression was fierce and tender all at once. "This is my home, my responsibility, and you..." He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then pushed forward. "You're mine to protect. I won't fail at that, not while I'm breathing." The possessiveness in his voice should have rankled. Instead, it made her chest ache with something too big to name. "Then don't stop breathing," she said roughly. "You hear me? Don't you dare stop breathing." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "I'll do my best." Another crash came from the side of the cabin, followed by Cutter's mocking laughter. "Tick-tock, Boon. Time's running out." Silas checked the rifle one final time, then moved to the door. His hand rested on the bar, but he didn't lift it yet. He turned back to Lila one more time. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does," he continued, his voice brooking no argument, "you bar this door and you don't open it for anyone except Henry Colfax or Sheriff Morrison. You fire shots through the window to draw attention. Someone will come. Eventually, someone will come." "Silas, promise me." She wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the possibility he was laying out so calmly, but the look in his eyes demanded honesty, not comforting lies. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded once, then lifted the bar and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a fist, but Silas barely felt it. Every sense was focused on the two shapes moving in the darkness beyond the porch. Garrett stood near the corner of the cabin, a rifle in his hands. Cutter was closer to the barn, also armed. "Well, well," Garrett drawled, straightening. "The man himself. Took you long enough." "Last warning," Silas said, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "Leave now, and this ends here." "See? That's where you're wrong." Garrett took a step forward. "This ends when we say it ends. We've been thinking, me and Cutter. This is good land, good cabin, worth taking. You can't take what's not yours. Who's going to stop us? You?" Cutter laughed. "You're one man, Boon. There's two of us. One man who knows every inch of this property, who's been preparing for this." Silas kept his voice level, even as his mind raced through calculations. Distance to Garrett, 30 feet. To Cutter, 45. Both armed but drunk, which meant poor aim but unpredictable actions. "You really want to die for a piece of land that'll never be yours?" Big talk from someone who's outnumbered. Garrett raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at Silas, but making the threat clear. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put down that rifle. Then you're going to walk back inside, gather up whatever money you have, and bring out that woman. We'll take what we want and leave you alive. Fair trade." "There's nothing fair about it." "Fair's got nothing to do with it. It's just how things are." Silas felt the cold clarity that came before violence settle over him. He'd felt it only once before, the day he'd stepped between his father and his mother for the last time. The day he'd learned what it meant to fight for something that mattered more than his own survival. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "This is just how things are." He dropped to one knee as he brought the rifle up, the movement smooth and practiced. Garrett's eyes widened in surprise, his own rifle swinging toward Silas too slowly. The crack of Silas's shot split the night, and Garrett's rifle flew from his hands as the bullet struck the barrel, the impact numbing his grip. Garrett stumbled backward with a shout of pain and rage. Cutter raised his own rifle, but he was too far away and too drunk. His shot went wide, splintering wood on the porch post behind Silas. Inside the cabin, Lila heard the gunfire and her heart stopped. She ran to the window, peering through the gap in the shutters. She could see Silas on the porch, could see Garrett diving behind the water trough for cover, could see Cutter advancing from the barn. Then she heard it, the creak of wood from the back of the cabin. Someone was trying to get in through the back window. A third man. There had been a third man they hadn't seen. Terror lanced through her, but she forced it down. She'd made Silas a promise, and she would keep it. She moved to the back of the cabin, raising the revolver with both hands the way Silas had taught her. Breathe steady. Aim center mass. Don't hesitate. The shutter on the back window burst inward, and a man started to climb through. He was younger than Garrett or Cutter, lean and dirty, with wild eyes that fixed on her with predatory intent. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," he said, grinning. "Looks like you're all alone." Lila pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her backward, and her ears rang from the blast in the enclosed space. The man screamed and fell back through the window, clutching his shoulder where her shot had struck. She heard him hit the ground outside, heard him cursing and scrambling away. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the revolver. She'd shot someone. Actually, shot someone. The reality of it tried to overwhelm her, but she shoved it aside. There would be time to fall apart later. Right now, Silas needed her to be strong. Outside, Silas had heard the shot from inside the cabin, and his heart nearly stopped. But he couldn't afford to be distracted, not with Garrett recovering behind the trough and Cutter advancing with murder in his eyes. "That's my brother you just shot!" Cutter screamed, his face twisted with rage. "I'm going to kill you for that!" So there had been 3 of them. The information clicked into place even as Silas was moving, diving off the porch as Cutter fired again. The bullet whined past where his head had been a second before. Silas hit the snow and rolled, coming up behind a stack of firewood. Splinters exploded around him as another shot struck the wood. He returned fire, but Cutter was already moving, using the barn as cover. This was going badly. They had him pinned down, and if they circled around, they could catch him in a crossfire. He needed to change the dynamic, needed to do something they wouldn't expect. Behind the water trough, Garrett had retrieved a pistol from his belt. His hands were still numb from the rifle impact, but rage was overriding the pain. That homesteader had humiliated him, shot at him, and now his cousin Billy was bleeding somewhere behind the cabin. "Cutter!" he shouted. "Circle around! We'll box him in!" Inside the cabin, Lila heard Garrett's plan and made a decision. She couldn't just hide here while Silas fought alone. She moved back to the front window and carefully opened the shutter a crack. Through the gap, she could see Garrett behind the trough, could see him gesturing to Cutter. Her hands were still shaking, but she forced them steady. She'd shot once. She could do it again. She aimed through the gap and fired. The shot went wide, but it served its purpose. Garrett jerked in surprise and ducked lower. More importantly, it told Silas exactly where the threat was. Silas used the distraction to sprint from the woodpile to the corner of the barn. Cutter saw him coming and fired, but the shot went high. Silas reached the barn wall and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. "You can't win this, Boon," Garrett called out. "Give it up. We'll make it quick." "You first," Silas shouted back. He risked a glance around the corner and saw Cutter advancing on the cabin's far side. If he got to Lila, if he got through that window. The thought sent ice water through Silas's veins. He couldn't let that happen, wouldn't let that happen. He stepped out from cover and fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot missed. The second caught Cutter in the leg, and the man went down with a howl of pain. But Silas had exposed himself. Garrett saw his chance and took it, firing 3 times. The first shot missed. The second grazed Silas's arm, a line of fire that made him stagger. The third went wide. Silas felt warm blood soaking through his sleeve, but the wound was superficial. He'd had worse. He levered another round into the chamber and advanced on Garrett's position. "It's over, Garrett," he called out. "Your friend's down. Your brother or cousin or whoever he is ran off bleeding. It's just you now. You can ride away or you can die here. Your choice." For a long moment, there was silence. Then Garrett's voice came back and all the bravado was gone. In its place was something desperate and dangerous. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" A harsh laugh. "You're nothing, Boon, just another fool trying to carve something out of land that doesn't want you. And that woman, you think she's yours? She's an arrangement, a transaction. She doesn't belong to you." "You're right," Silas said, and his voice carried absolute certainty. "She doesn't belong to me. She belongs to herself. But she chose to be here, and I'll be damned if I let someone like you take that choice away from her. He stepped around the water trough, rifle raised. Garrett was slumped against it, his pistol lying in the snow beside him. His shirt was dark with blood, not from a bullet wound, but from his nose, broken when he ducked too hard and hit the trough. He looked up at Silas with hatred burning in his eyes. "Go ahead," he spat. "Shoot me. Make yourself a killer." Silas looked down at him, and the rage that had been driving him cooled into something harder, something final. "I'm not going to kill you," he said. "I'm going to give you the same chance I've given you twice before. Get on your horse and ride away. Take your friends with you. If I ever see any of you on my property again, if I even hear your name spoken in connection with this place, then I will kill you. And it won't be murder, it'll be justice." He stepped back, lowering the rifle slightly, giving Garrett room to stand. Garrett stumbled to his feet, pressing a hand to his bleeding nose. He looked toward where Cutter was groaning in the snow, then toward the back of the cabin where Billy had disappeared. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," Silas said quietly. "It is." He kept the rifle trained on Garrett while the man limped to where Cutter lay. Together, bloodied and beaten, they helped each other toward their horses. Billy appeared from behind the cabin, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face white with pain and fear. Lila watched from the window as the three men mounted up, their movements clumsy and agonized. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction, wanted to glory in their defeat. Instead, she just felt tired and sick and grateful it was over. She heard Silas's boots on the porch, heard the door open. She turned as he stepped inside, and the sight of blood on his sleeve made her gasp. "You're hurt." "It's nothing, just a graze." But his face was pale beneath the beard, his eyes bright with the aftermath of violence. Lila crossed to him and touched his arm gently, peeling back the torn fabric to examine the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but not life-threatening. Relief made her knees weak. "We need to clean this," she said. "In a minute." Silas moved to the window and watched as the three riders disappeared into the darkness. He stood there for a long time, making sure they were really gone. Finally, he turned back to Lila. "Are you hurt? I heard a shot inside." There was a third man. He tried to come through the back window. She swallowed hard. "I shot him." Something fierce and proud flashed across Silas's face. "Did you kill him?" "No, shoulder wound. He ran off." "Good." He crossed to her and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the violence still humming through him. "You did good, Lila. You were brave and smart, and you probably saved both our lives." The praise, the warmth in his voice, broke something open inside her. All the fear and adrenaline came flooding out, and she found herself shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Come here," Silas said softly, pulling her against his chest. His arms came around her, solid and strong, and he held her while she trembled. "It's all right. You're safe. It's over." "Are you sure?" she managed. "What if they come back?" "They won't. They're beaten and bloodied and scared. Word will spread about what happened here tonight. People will know this property is defended." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "They won't come back." Lila wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. She looked up into his face and saw absolute certainty there. "Okay," she whispered. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the fire crackled and the adrenaline slowly drained away. Then Lila remembered the blood on his sleeve and pulled back. "Sit down," she ordered. "Let me take care of that arm." She worked with steady hands despite her earlier shaking, cleaning the wound with water she heated on the stove and binding it with strips of clean cloth. Silas sat still under her ministrations, watching her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "There," she said finally, tying off the bandage. "It should heal clean if you don't do anything stupid." "I'll try to avoid stupid things," Silas said, and there was the ghost of a smile in his voice. Lila started to move away, but his hand caught her wrist gently. "Wait!" She looked at him, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "I meant what I said out there," he said quietly. "About you choosing to be here. About defending that choice." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "But I need you to know, if you ever want to leave, if this life isn't what you want, I won't stop you. I brought you here through an arrangement, but you're free, Lila. You've always been free. You can go whenever you want. The offer, so honest and painful, made her throat tight. He was giving her a choice, real choice, with no strings attached. What if I don't want to go? She asked softly. Something flickered in his expression. Hope, maybe, or fear. Then I'd like you to stay. Not as an arrangement, not as an obligation, but as... He stopped, searching for the right words. As what? Lila prompted, her heart hammering. As my partner, Silas said finally. My equal. Someone I build this life with, not someone who just lives in it. He took a shaky breath. As someone I care about more than I've ever cared about anyone. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Lila looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but respect, who'd protected her without asking for anything in return, who'd just fought for her right to choose her own path. And she made her choice. I'm staying, she said, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because this is where I want to be, with you, building something together. Relief and joy washed across Silas's face, transforming it. You mean that? I mean it. She took his face in her hands the way he'd done to her so many times. I'm staying, Silas Boon, and you're stuck with me. He laughed then, actually laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and careful and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be... whatever this is. Neither do I, Lila said. But I figure we can learn together. Together, Silas repeated, like he was testing the word. I like the sound of that. They stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch one more time to be sure. But the hours passed quietly, and when dawn finally broke pale and cold over the Montana hills, they were still there, still safe, still together. Spring came slowly to the high country, but it came. The snow began to melt in earnest by late March, revealing the brown earth beneath. Lila stood in the garden plot, the book on plants open beside her, and started the work of preparing the soil. Her hands were still soft from winter, but they would toughen. Everything did, given time. Silas worked beside her, turning the earth with a spade while she broke up clods and pulled out rocks. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from knowing each other's rhythms. Plant the potatoes here, Lila said, marking out a section with a stick. And the beans there. They'll help each other grow. You're the expert, Silas said, but there was warmth in his voice. Pride. Over the past months, something profound had shifted between them. They were still learning each other, still finding their way, but the foundation was solid. Partnership. Trust. Something that was growing into love, though neither of them had said the word yet. They'd heard through Henry Colfax that Garrett, Cutter, and Billy had left the territory entirely, driven out by shame and injury and the spreading story of what had happened that night. The tale had grown in the telling. Some versions had Silas facing down 6 men. Others had Lila shooting from horseback. But the core truth remained. The Boon farm was defended, protected. Not a place to trifle with. Other things had changed too. Silas smiled more now, the hard edges softening. Lila spoke up more often, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. They'd established new routines that belonged to both of them. Morning coffee shared at the table, evening walks around the property to check on things, nights spent talking by the fire about plans and dreams and the future they were building. And the bed. They still shared it, but the careful distance had gradually closed. Now they slept curved together for warmth, Silas's arm around her waist, Lila's head on his shoulder. It felt natural. Right. Lila, Silas said, breaking into her thoughts. He'd stopped digging and was looking at her with that intensity that still made her breath catch. There's something I want to ask you. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. What is it? He set down the spade and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. These past months, you've made this place feel like a home instead of just a building. You've made me feel like... He paused, struggling. Like I'm not alone anymore. Like I matter to someone. You do matter, Lila said softly. You matter to me. Then make it permanent. The words came out in a rush. Marry me. Not because of some arrangement or contract, but because you want to. Because you choose me the way I choose you. Lila's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst from her chest. She looked at this man who'd given her safety, respect, partnership, and something she'd never dared hope for, love. Real, honest love that asked for nothing but offered everything. Yes, she said, smiling so hard her face hurt. Yes, I'll marry you. Relief and joy transformed his face. He pulled her close and kissed her, deep and sure and full of promise for all the years ahead. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing, giddy with happiness. When? Silas asked. Whenever you want. Tomorrow. Next week. Next month. How about when the garden comes in? He gestured to the freshly turned earth. Seems fitting. Starting our marriage at the same time we're harvesting what we planted together. Lila nodded, her throat too tight for words. It was perfect. All of it was perfect. They worked the rest of the day side by side, planting seeds that would grow into food to sustain them through the next winter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they stood at the edge of the garden and surveyed their work. It's going to be beautiful, Lila said. It already is, Silas replied, but he was looking at her when he said it. The wedding took place in late July, when the garden was bursting with life and the summer sun warmed the Montana hills. Henry Colfax stood as witness, along with a few other neighbors who'd come to respect the couple who'd defended their land and their right to build a life together. The ceremony was simple, held in the yard under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Lila wore a new dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Silas had bought in town, pale green like spring growth. Silas wore his best shirt and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. When the traveling preacher asked if they took each other freely and without reservation, both answered with absolute certainty. I do. They celebrated with a meal from the garden. Potatoes and beans and fresh greens, bread Lila had baked that morning, preserves from last fall. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built, spread out on the table as proof that broken people could find each other and create something whole. That night, after the neighbors had gone home and the cabin was quiet, Silas and Lila stood together by the window, looking out at their land. The garden, the barn, the hills rolling away into purple distance. Are you happy? Silas asked quietly. Lila leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart. I didn't know I could be this happy. I didn't know happy was even possible for someone like me. What do you mean, someone like you? Someone broken. Someone who'd been through... She stopped, the old shame trying to surface. Silas turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You were never broken. You were hurt, yeah. Damaged by people who should have protected you. But broken? No. Broken things don't grow. And look at you. He gestured to everything around them. The thriving garden, the well-kept cabin, the life they'd created. Look at what you've grown into. Tears slipped down Lila's cheeks, but they were good tears. Healing tears. We grew into it, she corrected. Together. Together, Silas agreed. He pulled her close and she wrapped her arms around him, holding tight to this man who'd shown her what it meant to be valued, to be chosen, to be loved. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the summer night deepened around them. Outside, crickets sang, and somewhere in the distance a nightbird called. The world went on, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. But here, in this small circle of light, in this cabin they'd defended and this land they'd tended, two wounded people had found something neither had thought possible. They'd found home. Not in a place, though the place mattered, not in security, though they'd fought for that too, but in each other, in the choice they made every day to stay, to build, to tend what they were growing together. Lila Mercer Boon had arrived frightened and broken, expecting the worst from a silent farmer in a rough frontier cabin. What she'd found instead was safety, partnership, and a love that had grown from careful patience into something strong enough to weather any storm. And Silas Boon, who'd spent most of his life alone and guarded, had discovered that opening his heart to someone was the bravest thing he'd ever done. that building a life with someone who chose him freely was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of vulnerability. As summer deepened and the garden flourished, and their life together found its rhythm, they learned what it meant to truly belong, not to a place or a person, but to a partnership, to a shared vision of what life could be when two people decided to stop surviving and start living. The harsh Montana winter would come again. There would be hard days ahead, challenges neither could foresee, but they would face them together, the way they'd faced everything else. And that, Lila thought as she stood in her husband's arms watching the stars come out over their land, was more than enough. It was everything.